You like how I had a ringer in the front row there? Yeah. Thank you, honey. Hi, everybody. I'm Lauren Schiller, as Marissa said. Welcome to Inforum at the Commonwealth Club. I'm so honored to be here with all of you and with Betty to celebrate Women's History Month and International Women's Day, which is today, March 8th. So a few words about Betty before we jump into our conversation. As Marissa mentioned, Betty's the oldest serving career park ranger in the country. Yes. But I want applause after I get through the name of the park that she works at, which is the Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront National Historical Park in Richmond, California.
Yeah. Good.
Thank you. Did I get that right? Yeah. Where Betty gives talks 3 days a week. So being a park ranger is maybe her fifth, sixth, seventh career. She's done quite a bit, including being a clerk in the Segregated Boilermakers Union during World War II. She's been an activist, a singer-songwriter, and a field representative for California State Assemblywomen Dion Araner and Lonnie Hancock. Betty's got an honorary degree from Mills College and the California College of the Arts, and even introduced President Barack Obama at the National Tree Lighting Ceremony a couple of years ago.
Yes.
Which puts all of us 1 degree of separation from Barack Obama. And that's just a small slice of her life, of your life. At 96 years of age, it's an understatement to say that you have seen and done a lot.
I'm sure I have.
So I went to see Betty at I'm just going to call it the Rosie Museum. Is that okay?
Yeah.
The Rosie
Okay.
Museum this week. And one of the things that you said, Betty, when you gave your talk is, we have to go back and see the past for what it was so we can see how far we've come.
Absolutely. We have to recognize in truth where we have been, because other than that, we have no way to know how we got to where we are, because we have been many nations over the years, and some of them I've lived through. Some of them were not very comfortable.
So your great-grandmother was a slave?
Yes, my great-grandmother, Leontine Bro Allen, born into slavery in 1846 in St. James Parish, Louisiana, and was enslaved until her 19th birthday, which time she married George Allen, who was a corporal in the Louisiana State Colored Troops, fighting on the side of the North in the Civil War. She lived to be 102, not dying until
Amazing.
1948. When I was 27 years old, a mother, married, and I knew my slave ancestor as the matriarch of my family.
So what did she ever tell you what life was really
She didn't
like?
so much tell me, because she only spoke a patois French, which was a language that was reserved for the adults in my family. They used it to gossip in.
They never taught you you anything?
Yeah. No.
Oh.
They would drift in and out of French and in English when I was a child, but that left soon after. The stories that I have of my great-grandmother mostly come to me through my mother's younger sister, who knew and loved my great-grandmother very much. And so that the stories that I have come through my grandfather, her eldest son, and my mother's youngest sister.
So I read in one of your blog posts, so Betty's a blogger, you all can follow her, that you were doing an interview with someone who didn't want you to say anything too, difficult or challenging about slavery. They wanted you to just keep it nice and tidy.
Yes.
Is that and your response was, what? Is that possible?
Yeah, my response was, how do you clean that up? I mean,
Non-controversial. That was what they asked you for.
yeah.
Yeah.
It was a family show coming out of the Universal Studios in Southern California, where I was invited to participate. And it seemed to me that there was a Disneyfication of history that I was being asked to participate in. I couldn't do that. And it's true. that they wanted to mention my great-grandmother, but they didn't want to mention slavery.
That makes no sense.
How do you do that?
Yeah. So what I mean, is there anything that has just stuck with you about what was passed on about your great grandmother's
Oh.
time? I mean,
She was amazing.
yeah.
She was the midwife, the intern to the doctor who came through about every 3 months on horseback into St. James Parish. My great-grandmother was the one who delivered the village babies and took care of people. Her job was to go out on horseback and drop a white towel over the gatepost every place he was to be needed when he came through. And after he would come through, he would confer with her on the aftercare of the patients. So she was sort of the caretaker for her village. And that struck with me. That's a story that came down in my family from my grandfather and from my mother's younger sister. And it sort of set the patterns for me when I was very young. I thought that was an incredible thing for her to be.
Yeah. So what do you mean it set the patterns for you?
Because when I was in Washington, the first award that I received was from the National Women's Political Caucus, National Women's History Project. And I knew that I was going to get this award at a hotel ceremony that evening. Went down to Anacostia, to the museum there in the African part of Washington, D.C. And there was an exhibit of midwives of the Civil War period. Wonderful pictures. And I found myself bursting into tears at the sight because she only had that role in my fantasies. I had never seen her in that role. But that evening, during the ceremonies, I found myself able to receive an award that I felt unworthy of, because you never feel worthy of those kinds of awards. But I felt it if I could accept it for her, because I realized that I had been wooed many times to run for public office, but this had never been a role that I wanted, that I had been dropping imaginary white towels over imaginary gateposts my whole life. And it was in that spirit that I was able to accept that first honor and have been accepting them ever since in her name.
Yes, seriously.
Thank you.
You mentioned your grandfather.
Yes.
Which I understand he was an inventor. An
Of
unrecognized.
my father's father.
Yes.
Yes.
So different grandfather.
Yes.
Okay, so on the patrilineal side.
He was Charbonnet, Louis Charbonnet. He was an eminent builder, millwright, engineer. His degree was out of Tuskegee University on correspondence courses. I have his books in my apartment, books that took him through Tuskegee. He left edifices all through New Orleans. There's a high school, Corpus Christi Church, which he built, the first convent for the first order convent for the first order of nuns, black nuns in this country, the Holy Family Sisters. He built that convent. I have all those, but he couldn't get patents because he was a Creole, African American. He couldn't get patents on anything that he built. He had to work under the licenses of a white contractor, always. So all of his buildings are under the names of others. That has been something that has been a cross that I've had to bear for my whole lifetime. But I don't believe that he ever resented it. It was the world as he lived in it. It was the nation that he was born into. He accepted it. I'm not so easily accepting. That part of the tradition I didn't carry with me.
Yeah. Was he able to see at any point in his life his name on one of his buildings or his inventions? No.
No, but I have maybe 24 old photographs, vintage photographs of his projects that have come down to me. There's a rice mill. There's a ballpark, the Crescent City Ballpark, that was designed and built by my great-grandfather. That under there was an entrance on one street, and from that entrance, it was a dance hall under the bleachers. This was at a time when ball players, there were black leagues, and the only people who played in those parks were African Americans. But I often wondered whether Branch Rickey did us very, very much good. We should have kept those because that ballpark I still take out and look at every now and then.
Yeah. Well, I have this notion that you have collected his drawings and photographs and things like that, and you've now passing them on to the.
Yeah, I'll be going back to Washington D.C. in April, and I'm going to donate them to the African American Museum.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So he will finally get
Yeah.
the recognition that he deserves. That's wonderful.
And he'll finally have the recognition he needs, deserves.
Yeah. Well, with all of this in your, the background of your life as you were growing up, and you were born in 1921.
Yes.
So as a little girl, what did you dream you wanted to be when you grew up?
I think I've lived my entire life in a constant state of surprise. I'm not a planner, nor am I a list maker.
A dreamer?
A dreamer maybe, but I don't remember. I guess before I was 20, my life was framed by the country that I was living in. At that time, I could not aspire to even college. I graduated from high school with 2 opportunities for employment open to me. I could have worked in agriculture, or I could have been a domestic servant. My elder sister, Marjorie, spent the first 5 years of her marriage as half of a domestic team. Her young husband was a chauffeur, and Marjorie was a housekeeper for a family in Piedmont. And because lived in on the premises with Thursdays off, which was traditional, they could save every penny they earned toward the down payment on their first home. And this was the traditional pathway into the middle class for African Americans. This is the country that I grew up in. I escaped that because there was a third choice. I married Mel Reed, whose family came out across the country from Griffin, Georgia, at the first sound of cannon fire, the Civil War. And in 1942, when I married, Mel was in his senior year at the University of San Francisco, playing left halfback for the San Francisco Dons. And what 19-year-old wouldn't prefer that? Mel, his father, and his grandmother were all born in Berkeley General Hospital on Dwight Way. So that my life took a turn at that point. But up to then, I had no ambitions that I can think of because I was limited by what was possible. Now, that meant that for about 20 years, I lived out in the Diablo Valley in an architecturally designed home, with my 4 kids that I raised to adulthood, outlived 2 husbands. Spent a lot of time with friends, some who were quite powerful, in my church or in my neighborhood. I returned 15 years ago. Well, after 20 years in the suburbs, I returned to Berkeley as a field representative, or a member of the California State Assembly. And if you're wondering whether I became a genius each of the time I was 20 and 15 years ago, may I quickly assure you that that's anything but true. That arc of my life from 20 to 15 years ago is not a sign of personal achievement, but a solid indication of how much social change occurred in this country over those intervening years. Something we all did, all of us. Black and brown and yellow and red and straight and gay and trans. And some of us did it kicking and screaming, and some of us are still kicking and screaming. But enough of us, because of what happened here in the city of Richmond, in the Bay Area generally, between those years of 1942 and 1945, during the Second World War homefront period. Because of that, enough of us completed that full trajectory so that to this day, social change continues to radiate out of the Bay Area into the rest of the country. And that was enough to build a park around.
Yeah.
That's what we did.
Yeah. So did you build your home in the Diablo Valley after the war or before the war?
No, 1953. Yes,
well after.
It was
Okay.
after the war, well after the war. And went through about 5 years of death threats because those people had built the suburbs with their GI Bill to get away from people like me. The year that we moved into our house, I had a third grader who was the only young African American child in his school. And that year, the PTA fundraiser was a minstrel show. And all of his teachers and the administrators were in blackface. Because that's who we were in 1953. That's who we were.
Did you discover that upon arriving at what you thought was going to be a fun school evening? Or how did you discover that?
I learned about the minstrel show from a neighbor who came to me the day before the show was to be shown, to be staged. And she told me about it. And I knew that that was wrong. But it was something that I'd never run into before. I had no idea of why it was wrong. But I got into my car and I went down to the school. I was led into the principal's office, sat there, and he was not in, but he came in five minutes later. His costume was hanging on the doorway. Big, blousy polka dots, red and white, black pants. He walked in about 5 minutes after I was there and saw my face and turned around to go out. And then he turned back, and I said, "You're having a minstrel show." And the poor man, miserable, embarrassed, said, "Yes." And I said, "You know that's wrong." And he said, "I didn't know that until I saw you there."
Oh,
And I said,
jeez.
he said, "But you know, don't really misunderstand. We're really showing how happy-go-lucky the colored people are." And I said, "Do I look happy?" And he said, "No." And I said, "You know that minstrel shows were created to ridicule black people." And he said, "No." And I said, "I know that your show is tomorrow evening, and I can't possibly ask you to cancel it because it's too late now. But I want you, when you have your dress rehearsal tonight, to explain my visit to you, to your staff." And I said, "Tomorrow evening I will be here sitting in the front row." And I did go with my neighbor, Bessie Gilbert, and we sat in the front row and cried all the way through it. But we made them do their minstrel show in our presence. But the next week, there was a Aunt Jemima pancake feed in the middle of Civic Center Park, so we didn't do that much show. But as I say, that's who we were in 1953.
Yeah. Well, I mean, talk about looking at the past for what it was.
Yeah.
I mean, you really explained something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a time of growth.
Yeah.
Yeah, for all of us.
What did you have to give yourself a good, like, how did you get up the courage to go and have that conversation? I mean,
I
that
had
must have been
no
really hard.
idea what I was going to say
Yeah.
when I walked in that place. I had no idea except that I had 3 children at home who were being wronged. That's all I knew.
Yeah.
That's all I knew. And I think that I've always been led by intuition. I figure I'll know when I get there, and I did. I don't know that we did any good, but I do know now that we were that we all had to bear the pain of our growth, all of us. But we did that here in the Bay Area. We withstood the pain of each other's growth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, even in building your home as the second Black family in the neighborhood, and the experience that you went through with that, you then saw that happen to yet another family,
Yes.
right? And then
There was a young couple that was moving into Gregory Gardens, which is a low-income community that was being constructed at the time. I read about them because there was an Improved Association meeting to find an answer to the intrusion of these people into their community.
improvement
Yes, Improvement
in
Association.
quotes.
And
okay.
I read it in the local paper and decided that where I had felt impotent against what was happening to our little family, that as a defender, I could have strength. And so I wrote a letter to the editor in the newspaper complaining about this. And someone, an attorney who lived in the area, a liberal attorney, named David Borton, who's now deceased, read my letter, found how to get to hold of me, called, and he wanted to offer help because I had said that I was going to attend that meeting. And he said, "You can't do that, Betty, because they'll hurt you." And I said, "No, they won't do that because people don't say those mean things in my presence. They only say them when I'm behind my back. So that if I go there, I will be able to tell them what I want to say, and then I will go." But I knew by that time that our community had gotten past this pretty much, and that I could tell them that it could be better. They could all get through this. So I drove out to the school, parked my car, and walked into the auditorium and sat about in the middle on the aisle seat. And I was not protected by my color because I'm so racially ambiguous that nobody picked it up. Though I was that Black family only 3 miles away, here that evening, I just blended into the crowd. And they went on with their meeting saying all those awful things that I had never heard them say. And at one point, a woman stood up and said, "If we can't get them out, the undesirables, if we can't get them out any other way, we can use the health department on the basis of the filthy diseases they bring in." And at which point, I couldn't any longer stand it because I didn't want to be eavesdropping. So I got up and I walked to the front of the auditorium and I talked for about 10 minutes and then ran out because I panicked. Got into my car, and David Borton was there. I heard it had been daylight when I parked my car, and it was dark when I came out of the meeting, and I heard footsteps behind me. I thought I was being chased, but apparently there was a reporter who came and tapped me on the shoulder just before while I was struggling with my key in the car, in the lock. And he said, he identified himself as being a reporter, said, "I need to know your name and give me your telephone number. I will call you because I need to get back in to see what happens now." And then David Borton introduced himself. He was one of those that was running out of the building, and he comforted me, and that was beginning of my being able to take on. That made that Improvement Association never met again. That
You're
was
here.
fine. I'm not sure. I wasn't sure that I was ever successful. Over time, I think that I was, because that same community that was so disturbed by our being there, sent me 20 years later to represent them as a McGovern delegate to Miami Beach. That's how fast social change was occurring.
That's an incredible story.
Yeah.
Well, we should probably talk about Rosie, the riveter.
Yeah.
She's become something of a feminist icon.
Yes.
But there's something missing from that narrative for you. She's not your icon.
No, she's not, because but where do we begin? 15 years ago, when I went back into the valley, we came back into the city from the valley, as a field representative, the park was created in my assembly district. It simply rose up. The Rosie Memorial, which had caught national attention, was less than a mile from my office in Richmond. I was in a satellite office, one-person office. And even though it was only a mile away, I had never seen fit to visit it because that was a white woman's story. The women in my family had been working outside their homes since slavery. Because back in 1942, it took $47.25 a week to support a family of 5, if you were white. But our fathers and our uncles were all members of the service workers generation, earning $25 to $35 a week. Pullman porters earned $18 a week plus tips. So it had always taken 2 wages to support black families. So that story, it wasn't that I was boycotting the Rosie story, it simply had nothing to say to me. But when the Department of Interior planners were gathered in my assembly district and held their first meetings to begin to frame this park, that was when I discovered the national parks, because it was coming into my area and being defined by scattered sites that lay throughout the city, which I instantly recognized as sites of racial segregation. But it's also true that nobody in that room knew that but me, because what gets remembered is determined by who's in the room doing the remembering. There wasn't any grand conspiracy to leave my history out. There simply wasn't anybody in that room that had any reason to know that but me. And I became involved in the planning of the stories because the Child Development Center, the Maritime Child Development Center, did not service black families at all. Atchison Village was built by the Maritime Commission. It was part of the parks, but it was built to house temporarily Kaiser management. But there wouldn't have been any black managers at the time, so the question was moot. But Nystrom Village, which was to be restored to show how workers lived, was built by HUD. But you couldn't live in Nystrom Village unless you were white. But there wasn't anybody else in that room that knew that but me. And where the story of Rosie the Riveter is extremely important as a feminist story and as a feminist icon, there were many, many stories on the home front. There was a story of the internment of 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans, 70,000 of whom were American citizens. There was that great story of the explosion at Fort Chicago, in which there were 320 lives lost, 202 of them being black dock workers. The mutiny trials, because 50 of those men refused to go back and load those ships because nobody could explain what had happened.
So this was the ammunition
Yes.
that they were loading
At
onto the
Port
ship had
Chicago.
exploded,
Yes.
and they didn't want to go back because they were
If you
scared.
didn't live in the Bay Area, you had no idea that Port Chicago even happened. that those ships had even two Kaiser ships. There were so many stories that the home front, there were 37,600 lives lost in industrial accidents in the home front alone, lives that were never memorialized. That story is so complex and has so many moving parts that being reminded of that became something that I was obsessed with, because the story was so important and had been so lost to history. And so that's when I became, on a 4-year contract, a consultant to the National Park Service, because you guys had forgotten all that good stuff.
Yeah. Well, it's so much easier to look at her pretty face and her, her flexed arm and be like, yeah, unity, we got this.
And I
Right.
really think that story, because I'm so passionate about my story, that story gets crowded out, because there is an important white feminist story that we don't get to. And someday we're going to get a kick-ass white feminist that's going to tell that story just as I tell mine.
Right. But she's not in the front of the room.
No.
So. Anyway, she's on a lunchbox. She's on posters.
Yes.
Rosie the Riveter is getting her day in the sun. That's for sure. Well, so would you have been a Rosie if you could have been?
No.
No.
That was simply beyond my imagination. Since I worked in a Jim Crow segregated union hall that was nowhere near the shoreline, I never saw a ship under construction, nor did I ever see a ship being launched. All of that history completely escaped me. I wasn't even always sure who the enemy was during that period. So I would not have ever aspired to Rosie, because that was simply beyond my imagination. I've learned more about that history since I've been a ranger than I ever knew before.
Mm. Well, even the job you did hold was not a typical job for a woman, right?
I was a file clerk. No. And actually, being a file clerk in 1942 was a step up. My folks were really proud of me. I wasn't making beds in a hotel. I wasn't taking care of white people's children or cleaning white people's houses. Wasn't emptying bedpans in some hospital or rest home. I was a clerk, which in 1942 would have been the equivalent of today's young woman of color being the first in her family to enter college, because that's who we were. Those would be the equivalents.
How did you get that job?
I backed into it. As I did with most of my life. I came onto the National Park Service at first as a consultant on a 4-year contract. And after 4 years, became a National Park Ranger at the age of 85. Which the congratulations go to the National Park Service, not to me. I can't imagine the conversations that were held in Washington about that. But I have now been a permanent park ranger for 11 years.
Well, how did you get the job? Oh, yes. Okay, let's. Yes. How did you get the job as the file clerk?
Because the unions were putting us together simply by the color of our skin. The executive secretary of the Jim Crow Union Hall was a friend of mine, Marlon Rawls, who was brought out here by his minister's uncle, who was chosen by the Boilermakers and put him in charge of the unions. He was a minister from Oakland because he was the right color. And then he felt that was not fitting for a black minister, so he sent for his nephew, Marlon Rawls, in Chicago, who came out. And because we were social friends, those unions were made up of people of color, mostly because they were connected socially.
Networking.
Yeah. Yeah.
What was the social scene like in Richmond at that time? With
I don't know, because I was not living in Richmond. I'd grown up in Oakland. I came into Richmond simply to work and went home every night to carpool, nowhere near the shoreline. So I wasn't a part of that at all. I had no idea.
What was a typical day? Wake up, go to work, go home, go to sleep, or did
Yeah,
you
we
ever
came to
get out?
work in a carpool, went home at night. Never had anything to do with Richmond until I came in as a ranger.
Um, you said something just a few minutes ago about what gets remembered as a function of who's in the room doing the
Yeah, that's
remembering.
true.
So this is kind of a philosophical question, but you can maybe answer it tangibly, which is, how do you get in the room?
How can I answer that? No, it's related to another question that I can't answer. There's been a drive in the National Park Service for a number of years now to encourage more people of color into the park system. And I keep running into that constantly. There are special programs. There are kids gathered up in inner cities and delivered to national parks so that we can have representations in the parks. And there's been an honest to goodness effort to get people into the parks. And I find myself feeling like the parks, the national parks, are really created and used by the middle class. You have to have the leisure time and the financial resources in order to take advantage of the parks. And as the National Park, as a federal agency, concentrates on bringing more people of color into the middle class with a jobs program, we'll find our way into the park. And I think that that's the answer that I would give.
I've heard that if any group is comprised of at least 30% of pick anything, 30% women, 30% people of color, 30%, you name it, that's the tipping point. That's the point at which more people who fit into that category will join in.
I don't know. I'm sure that there's a critical mass
Right.
that would be operating and that might be true. I am surprised sometimes and not at other times that my audiences at the national parks don't have nearly as many people of color as I would expect to have, because my presentations are clearly out of my shoes. But then when I realized that those were years of rejection, that there's very little to be nostalgic about if you're not white, of the periods of 1942 to 1945. My young husband, who was, as I say, left halfback for the San Francisco Dons, went down immediately when the war was declared to enlist, fight for his country, and found himself in the Messman's Corps because the only thing a young black man could do was cook in the Navy. He lasted only 3 days and refused because he'd grown up as a Californian, not as an African American. He had never faced into that level of discrimination. He lasted 3 days. The commanding officer, who was on the committee that examined him, decided that he was clearly honest and that his intent was not to get out of serving, but wanting to define how he was going to serve. Decided to give him mustering out pay, an honorable discharge, told him just to forget that it ever happened, but that they could not put a man who was a natural leader of men onto a ship where men might be easily led because it might spell mutiny. So they sent him home, and he went to his grave believing that he'd failed his country when his country had failed him. That was kind of who we were.
Yeah.
And thank God we're not there anymore.
Yeah. Do you feel like we've made enough progress?
Oh, I don't think we'll ever make. I think that it's a fallacy to believe that democracy will ever be fixed. It's a process. And it has to be regenerated by every single generation. It has to be recreated. We'll always be forming that more perfect union and promoting the general welfare. I don't know that we'll ever get there. I'm not sure that's the object. I think the 39% turnout 4 years ago in the election was predictive of the 400% turnout in the most recent election. We have a constitutionally protected right to be wrong, or a constitutionally protected right to be bigots if that's what we want to be. That's part of the freedoms. But we've also created this incredible system of national parks where it's now possible for us to visit almost any era in our history. The heroic places, the contemplative places, the scenic wonders, the shameful places, and the painful places, in order to own that history, own it, that we may process it, in order to begin to forgive ourselves, in order to move toward a more compassionate future. Because I don't believe that we have yet processed the Civil War as a nation. And though they weren't designed for that purpose, that's how I see the national parks at this point in my life. That's the national park that I'm involved in.
Yeah, it's so easy to think of history as just this dry, boring thing we have to learn in school. But it's so
No,
not.
it's an amazing, amazing trip. No.
Yeah. Well, what about, I mean, I feel like we're, you said democracy is constantly reinventing itself. And I feel like we're in another one of those moments of reinvention.
Yeah.
Women's voices are being elevated more than ever. The Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement. What do you see, what would you like to say to the leaders of those movements that will help them keep making progress?
I think that at 96, I have lost my sense of future. There are no models for me anymore. I've outlived my peer group. What's happened in compensation is that I now am more aware of the past. And I am aware that these periods of chaos are cyclical, and that they've been happening since 1776. And that in those periods, I sense that we're on an upward spiral. We keep touching the same places at higher and higher levels. Higher and higher levels. I'm not enslaved like my great-grandmother was. And each time we hit one of these places, and we're in one of them now, that's when democracy is being redefined. And that's when we have access to the reset buttons. And when that happens, on this upward spiral, we're setting the stage for the next generation. And that gives me great hope. And I think in that process, the national park is one of our greatest tools.
That's a total reframing of the National Park Service for me.
I don't think they know that yet. I don't think that Teddy Roosevelt would have be.
You didn't realize, kids, pack your bags. We're going on the road.
He didn't know what he was building.
Yeah. Well, maybe he did. So, Betty, you've seen a lot of change. You've also been an agent of change. The story that you told about the horrible minstrel show and the Diablo Valley homeowners, and what is there something that gives you the courage to stand up or motivates you? I know you said you go into the room and it's just your intuition. You don't know what you're going to say, but there must be some theme song or something that that sends you out with the mission to make a change.
I'm not sure. Partly, as I say, I've lived my entire life in this constant state of surprise. And I think I've enjoyed that. I think that I reinvented myself about every 10 years. I get restless, and I wonder what's coming next. I don't know how to answer that because I don't spend much time regretting yesterday, nor planning for tomorrow. It's all now for me.
Well, are there any? Is there anything that for the? I've got two of my children sitting in the front row here, and there may be other kids in the audience. I see a couple. Is there anything that you would like them to know that they can
Yeah,
take with them
I
tonight?
I think that there's a place on the film that we show that was, it's called Homefront Heroes, that's shown as an orientation film for my presentations at the park. And there's a place on the film where Agnes Moore, a still living Rosie, says that that period of 1942 to 45 was the greatest, what is it? Yeah, the greatest coming together that she'd ever seen of the American people, that she'd ever lived through. And when she first used to say that on the film, and I would stand up against the wall and watch her, and I'd say, how can Agnes say that? She knows that isn't true, and I'm going to have to talk to that woman. And one day after my 90th birthday, I was suddenly able to hear that as Agnes's truth. And I realized that we all create our own reality, and that there are many truths. They rise out of religious conviction, they rise out of education, they rise out of life experience. And that many of those truths are in conflict. And as long as there's a place on the planet where Agnes's truth and mine can coexist, that was all I needed from that day forward. And I'd like to be able to tell every 14-year-old that comes through our park that insight, so they don't have to get to be 90 years old before they recognize it. Thank you.
Well, before we go to questions, I have to ask you one more thing.
Okay.
Which is, I understand that you played Spin the Bottle with Paul
I
Robeson.
sure did. I got kissed on the cheek by Paul Robeson.
Can you take us inside that moment?
I was a teenager, and we were picketing the Paramount Theater in Oakland, A Song of the South of Walt Disney. And Paul Robeson was in town, I think, to do something at the Moore Shipyards. And we met him there at the Paramount Theater. And afterward, there was a lemonade party for us kids. And Paul Robeson, it was at Matt Crawford's house in Berkeley. We played Spin the Bottle, and I got kissed by Paul Robeson.
And you'll never wash that cheek again. All right, shall we go to audience Q&A? All right. So I'm asked to remind you to keep your questions short and ending with question marks, as you were previously instructed, so we can get to as many people as possible. What is the first question?
Hello, they just told me I can't ask about your books. So that took away my question, but I'm going to move on. So I've been to Rosie the Riveter, and I've had the pleasure of hearing you speak. How do you think the audiences respond to what you say? Because I think sometimes they don't really know what they're going to get, and then you kind of just, lay it out on the line. So what do you think that they think when they hear you speak?
I don't really know. I can't speak for the audiences, but I do know that there is a readiness in the country right now for these conversations, that I have never been challenged. I know that some of the things that people that I say are maybe controversial, but not even within the system have I ever been challenged in any way. And another thing that happened was a few weeks ago, a woman sitting in the audience, when the questions first opened, raised her hand, the first person, and she said, "Tell me, why don't you speak like other black people?" And the same thing happened there that's happening here. There was an audible gasp in the audience. And I realized in that moment that I was within the circle and she was outside of it. And that the people in that audience were Bay Area people. And that she must have come from some other part of the country. That freed me to deal with her question without shaming her. And what I answered was that I grew up in California as a second-generation Californian, not as an African American. Taking her question seriously. I think that that's where we are. I think that we are ready for those questions. And I think we're ready for these conversations. And that the truths of those years are so much more powerful than the myths that we made up about it. And I think we're recognizing that. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Hello, new Facebook friend. How are you? Oh, we just became Facebook friends last week. We walk in the same circle with James Mills and Rue Mapp.
Oh, good. Okay.
My question is two parts. As one of the few African American female coaches in the rock climbing industry, all white, male dominated sport.
Yeah.
And just moving here from the South, in the Southeast, where I've spent 25 years in the industry, but saw my first African-American parks ranger here in California after 25 years of up and down the East Coast, Southeast. Two questions is one, how do I stay strong as a black woman going up against the industry, trying to do an industry that is embracing diversity, but extremely slowly as we are getting ready for the Olympics in 2020. We have the number one kid in America who is an African-American kid, and most of the country does not know that the number one kid representing the sport is African-American. The second part of that question is, when it comes to national parks that are not in California, that don't have brown and black faces, how do we continue to be advocates and strength, not emotionally beat down as the only voice or the angry black voice, female voice, to stand up and say we need to diversify, and here's how we diversify, and how can we listen to the black folks and how to diversify the national parks versus the white folks and how to diversify the national parks?
I think that those questions are already being dealt with in the National Park Service. There are seminars and there are workshops. The diversity is a very, very important feature of the National Park Service right now. And unlike your experience, I've traveled to Selma and Atlanta and Washington, D.C. and seen many, many African-American rangers I didn't know even existed. There are many, many more. I would like to see African Americans on staff at Grand Canyon. I would like to see them where we're not limited to the inner city, and that's not happened as far as I can see. I think that we don't, but those doors are open, and we may not be aware of it yet. But I think that they are open.
We have 3 more questions.
Uh-huh.
So I have to think of a question as I'm speaking. I really just wanted to let you know how much I admire you and for telling our stories, because they have gotten buried. And so I would suppose my question would be, what other stories or fantasies do you have to share with us?
What did I not ask you?
Yeah. I have no idea how to answer that, and thank you very, very much.
Can I be her proxy for? Is there one more question up there?
Yeah,
go
but
ahead.
you can go ahead and hit that one if you
Well, I'd like to be the proxy, which is, is there something that you'd still like to see happen in your life that you've been waiting for?
You know, I as I say, I don't know what to expect. I don't have a sense of future. I have pretty much lived out my dreams every single day. I'm feeling productive at this point in my life, more so than I think I'm using everything that I've ever learned right now. Right now, all of the women that I ever was are here in me. they are triggered by a song or a story or something I run into as I'm going through the laundry. And being that complex woman at this point in my life is so exciting in itself that I don't know that I would wish for anything more than what's going on right this minute. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
We have one more audience question.
Hi. So in listening to you talk, I can't help but think about, as you are a woman of color, as a park ranger, if you had any thoughts about environmental justice and social justice and racial justice and women's rights and kind of how those are finally in the past decade or so really coming together. And I don't know if you're involved in anything outside of what you do every day, but just any thoughts about that?
No, I have had the opportunity in the last month or so of attending Makers Conference in Southern California, where women from all over the country and the world, the leaders were there. This last weekend, I was in Bend, Oregon, with the Muse of the world, where there were, again, I felt like I wanted to run out and make a Faustian bargain for another 10 years. There is so much that's happening in the women's world right this minute. It is so exciting. I would love to be able to say that I'm going to be here in order to take advantage of it. But the Tarana Burke, the woman who created the Me Too movement, Gloria Steinem, Sheryl Stromberg, what's her
Sandberg.
name? Yeah.
Sheryl Sandberg.
These women are cutting new paths. I don't know where we're going, but it's going to be influenced by what's happening in the feminine world right now. It's being felt powerfully, and I would love to be able to know where that's going to go. And as a woman of color, I think that we're finding our places in leadership for the very first time in history. The political structure in the South is being guided by black women. This is an amazing time to be alive, to be a woman of color.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
I feel like everything you say, we just all need to take a moment and soak in. So we have one last question for you, which is an Inforum tradition, which is to ask you, what is your 60-second idea to change the world? No pressure.
I don't have a slightest idea what that is. I don't know. I think that if my world could learn to value the questions more than the answers, that would take us a long way. Because it's the questions as they mature that lead us to the next questions, which dictates progress. And I'd like to see that happen, that we become too satisfied with answers that are really ephemeral. They never last long and shouldn't. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Betty. Thank you so much for being here with all of us tonight.